The phone call that changed everything occurred at exactly 1:15 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, US. President Donald Trump placed a direct call to Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to present a deal the White House called a landmark critical minerals partnership. This wasn't just a simple trade agreement, it was a high-stakes attempt to fix a series of major problems between the two countries. For months, the US and Australia had been fighting over three big things: who gets access to Australia's massive mineral wealth, whether US Marines should keep their base in Darwin, and Australia's new decision to join a security group led by Mark Carney. Trump's goal was to bring Australia back into the American circle by offering a clean slate and ending the ongoing diplomatic and economic warfare between the two nations. By 2:47 p.m. in Washington, the White House released an official statement that made it look like the United States was being incredibly generous. Trump offered to take away every single retaliatory tariff that had been hurting Australian farmers and businesses. He also promised to restart the full sharing of top-secret intelligence through the Five Eyes network, which is the highest level of security cooperation in the world. Furthermore, he agreed to stop his public threats to withdraw American troops from northern Australia. In the eyes of the White House, they were handing Albanese a massive political victory. They believed that by offering to remove these penalties, they were giving Australia everything it had been asking for. However, all of these gifts came with one massive, non-negotiable requirement: a 15-year exclusive contract that would give the US total control over Australia's mining future. The details of this 15-year agreement were designed to solve America's biggest industrial and military fear: running out of the minerals needed for high-tech weapons and electric cars. Under this deal, the United States would get priority access to Australia's reserves of lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and rare earth elements. This means if there was a shortage, the US would get served first, and everyone else would get the leftovers. But the most shocking part of the offer was the price. Trump didn't want to pay the market price, which is what everyone else in the world pays based on supply and demand. Instead, he demanded a price cap of only 10% above the extraction cost. This means the US would only pay for the cost of digging the rocks out of the ground, plus a tiny 10% profit for the mining company. This would effectively allow American companies to buy these minerals at a massive discount, sometimes for half the price that other countries were paying. The deal also included a loyalty clause that would have fundamentally changed who Australia could do business with. The contract would have legally banned Australia from selling any of these minerals to any country the United States considers a strategic competitor. Right now, that list is focused on China, which is Australia's biggest trading partner. But Trump made it clear that this list was flexible. He signaled that he could expand the ban to include any nation participating in Mark Carney's new security fund. This meant that if the US had a disagreement with Canada, Japan, or even European allies, Trump could use this contract to prevent Australia from selling them the minerals they need for their own industries. It was an attempt to turn Australia into a private gas station and hardware store for the American military-industrial complex. The White House truly believed this was an offer Albanese could not refuse. In their official statement, they described it as the most generous deal an American president had ever offered to Australia. They were confident that the Australian government would see this as a historic opportunity to secure their national safety. By framing it this way, Washington was telling the world that Australia's role in the 21st century was to be the primary supplier for American power. They expected Albanese to be grateful for the removal of the tariffs and the return of the intelligence sharing. They viewed this as a fair trade. America provides the security umbrella and the military protection, and in exchange Australia provides the raw materials at a cheap fixed price for the next generation. They did not expect that Australia would view this as a threat to its own independence. The absolute confidence radiating from the White House turned out to be one of the most significant diplomatic miscalculations in modern history. The American administration expected a grateful acceptance, but instead, they were met with a total and public defiance. Less than 3 hours after the initial proposal, at 4:23 p.m. Australian time, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese walked into the Blue Room of Parliament House in Canberra. He did not come alone. He was flanked by his Minister for Resources and his Minister for Defence, signalling that this response was both an economic and a national security decision. There were no long introductory remarks or diplomatic fluff to soften the blow. He looked directly into the camera lens and delivered a single, devastating sentence that was designed to be heard by every government and every investor on the planet. Australia is not a mine for America. To ensure there was no room for misinterpretation, Albanese repeated the phrase for emphasis, making it clear that the answer to Donald Trump's proposal was a firm and final no. These 9 words effectively dismantled the core foundation of the Trump administration's foreign policy. For years, the Washington strategy had been built on the idea that American military protection was a product that allies had to pay for through economic servitude. By saying no, Albanese was rejecting the premise that a security alliance gives a larger nation the right to own the smaller nation's natural resources. This moment was the exact point where the special relationship between the two countries hit a wall. It was a clear statement that Australia would no longer accept a partnership that functioned as a hierarchy with the United States at the top, and Australia as a subordinate supplier. The impact of this rejection was felt instantly across the globe. Because the announcement happened while Washington was asleep, the news hit the rest of the world first. In Beijing, Tokyo, London, and Ottawa, governments watched the live feed and realized that the global supply chain for high-tech industry had just been thrown into chaos. By the time the administration in Washington woke up, they discovered that their closest ally in the Indo-Pacific, a country that has fought alongside the United States in every major war since World War I, had drawn a hard line in the sand. This wasn't just a disagreement over a contract, it was a public declaration of independence. Australia was telling the world that it would no longer be a resource colony that exists to subsidize the profits of American defense contractors, battery manufacturers, or the Pentagon's weapons programs. Albanese's message was blunt and easy to understand. Australian resources belong to Australians. He made it clear that the Australian government, not the White House, would decide what to sell, who to sell it to, and at what price. By demanding market rates instead of the discounted extraction cost Trump wanted, Australia was asserting that its national wealth would be used to benefit its own citizens, not to provide cheap parts for American corporations. This decision caused a massive shift in the global balance of power. The markets that control the materials for fighter jets, satellites, and electric vehicles suddenly realized that the United States no longer had guaranteed, easy access to the world's largest mineral reserves. This event marked the end of the age of assumed access, where big powers could simply demand resources from their allies, and began the age of competitive sovereignty, where every nation fights for its own economic value. This rejection also served as a signal to other nations that they could stand up to coercive trade demands. By choosing to prioritize Australian interests over American demands, Albanese broke the cycle of subordination that had defined the alliance for decades. He established the principle that a true partnership must be based on mutual respect and fair trade, not on one side dictating terms to the other. This was a global pivot point, because it proved that even the most advanced military power on Earth, the United States, is vulnerable if it loses the cooperation of the countries that control the raw materials of the future. The 9 words spoken in Canberra didn't just end a phone call, they rewrote the rules of 21st-century geopolitics. To understand why the Australian government rejected the American offer so quickly, you have to look at the specific predatory rules hidden inside the contract. Sources from both the Australian Prime Minister's office and the US National Security Council describe the deal not as a fair trade agreement, but as a blueprint for resource colonization. The first major issue was Clause 1, which focused on volume guarantees. Trump demanded that Australia commit to shipping massive fixed amounts of minerals to the United States every single year, regardless of whether Australia wanted to sell them elsewhere. Specifically, the US wanted 180,000 metric tons of lithium carbonate equivalent annually. To put that in perspective, that single requirement represents about 65% of everything Australia currently produces, and roughly 40% of the entire world's supply. Trump wasn't just asking for a seat at the table, he was asking to own the table. The demands for other minerals were equally aggressive. The US insisted on 12,000 metric tons of cobalt, 95,000 metric tons of nickel, and 3.2 million metric tons of manganese every year. Most critically, the deal demanded 28,000 metric tons of rare earth elements. These are not just any rocks, they include specific elements like dysprosium, terbium, and neodymium. These minerals are the secret sauce for modern warfare. They are used to build the permanent magnets that allow F-35 fighter jet engines to run, help missile guidance systems find their targets, and power the motors in nuclear submarines. These volume requirements were so high that they actually exceeded Australia's record production levels in several categories. This meant Australia would be legally forced to spend billions of its own dollars to build new mines just to satisfy American demand, leaving almost nothing left to sell to its other global partners. Clause 2 focused on price caps, and this is where the financial damage became truly extreme. Trump's deal didn't offer to pay the market price, the price determined by global competition. Instead, he demanded that Australia sell these minerals at a maximum of 10% above the extraction cost. Extraction cost is simply what it costs to dig the mineral out of the dirt and process it. For example, the market price for lithium is currently about $15,000 per metric ton. However, the cost to extract it in Australia is only about $6,800. Adding a 10% profit cap means the US would pay roughly $7,500. This would force Australia to sell its most valuable natural resources at a 50% discount. For 15 years, Australia would be handing over its national wealth for half of what it is worth, essentially giving a multi-billion-dollar gift to American car companies and defense contractors every single month. Clause 3 added a customer restriction that would have destroyed Australia's independence in world trade. This clause gave the United States a unilateral veto over who Australia could talk to. It prohibited Australia from selling minerals to any nation the US called a strategic competitor. While this currently targets China, Trump hinted that he could expand this definition to include any country in Mark Carney's new security fund. This was a massive trap, since countries like Canada, the UK, Germany, France and Japan are all part of that fund. Trump could have legally blocked Australia from selling minerals to its own traditional allies. Australia would have been contractually locked into a monopsony, a market with only one buyer, who also happened to be the buyer paying the lowest possible price. Finally, Clause 4 included penalty clauses that were designed to bankrupt Australia if they ever tried to back out or missed a shipment. If Australia failed to meet the huge volume guarantees, or if they tried to sell to a restricted nation like Germany or Japan, they would be fined $750 million every single month. That adds up to $9 billion a year in fines, which is about 2% of Australia's entire economy. When the Australian finance minister added everything up, the total was terrifying. Over the 15-year life of the deal, Australia would lose approximately $340 billion in revenue compared to selling at market prices. That is $340 billion taken directly away from Australian schools, hospitals, roads, and its own military, and handed over to subsidize the American industrial base. It was a deal that would have turned a sovereign nation into a low-cost warehouse for another country's ambitions. When Prime Minister Anthony Albanese stepped up to the podium in Canberra, his address was not a spur-of-the-moment reaction, but a carefully constructed, multi-layered strategic communication. Every sentence was intentional, designed to speak directly to specific audiences: the US administration, the global commodities market, and the Australian public. Simultaneously, he began by clearly and transparently outlining the exact terms of the proposal he had received from President Trump. By putting the specific demands out in the open, Albanese ensured the public and the international community understood exactly what Washington was trying to extract. By the time he transitioned to his refusal, the internal logic of his decision was undeniable. He framed the American proposal not as a collaborative alliance-building exercise, but as a clear attempt at captivity. He made it unequivocally clear that Australia's natural resources are held in a public trust for the benefit of current and future generations of Australians, and that no foreign power, regardless of the strength of an alliance, possesses the right to dictate how those resources are mined, valued, or exported. The most forceful and impactful part of his statement was the revelation of the 14 buyers. By announcing that Australia had already fielded formal purchase proposals from a diverse group of 14 nations spanning 5 continents, including powerhouses like Japan, South Korea, India, Germany, France, and Saudi Arabia, Albanese fundamentally altered the global negotiating dynamic. By inviting the United States to compete for Australian minerals on the same terms as every other nation, he effectively demoted the US from a position of preferred dominant partner to simply another bidder in a highly competitive global room. This move signaled to the world that Australia's door is open to genuine commercial trade, but that it would no longer accept the status of a subordinate. He signaled that the era of Australia granting exclusive discounted access to its national wealth in exchange for vague security promises was over. Albanese concluded his remarks with a direct message to the American people, acknowledging the long history of the alliance while standing firm on the requirement for mutual respect. He maintained that Australia values the friendship and the strategic partnership with the United States, but insisted that any such relationship must be built on the principle of sovereign equality. He flatly refused to trade Australia's long-term economic independence and sovereignty for what he called temporary relief from trade policies that, in his view, should never have been imposed by the US in the first place. After delivering this clear, defiant rejection, Albanese stepped back from the podium and exited the room without taking a single question, leaving no room for negotiation, backtracking, or further explanation. The aftermath of Australia's rejection can be traced through the cold, hard data of the markets, providing what analysts call the receipts that confirm the strategic gravity of the decision. Within a mere 90 minutes of Prime Minister Albanese's announcement, global commodity markets descended into a state of absolute frenzy. This was not a slow reaction, it was a fundamental repricing event. Lithium carbonate futures surged by an unprecedented 23%, while rare earth futures rocketed up by 31%, the largest single-session price move in the history of these markets. Traders and investors were reacting to a sudden, terrifying realization: the core assumption that the United States could rely on a guaranteed, cheap, and exclusive supply of Australian minerals was wrong. With that assumption shattered, American tech and defense giants were suddenly facing the prospect of competing against the entire world for the same limited supply, leading to an inevitable explosion in costs. This triggered what many are calling corporate carnage on Wall Street. As markets realized that companies like Tesla and General Motors could no longer count on cheap, priority access lithium for their battery supply chains, share prices tumbled. Tesla saw its value drop by 8.7%, while General Motors fell 6.2%. The pain extended deeply into the defense sector, where supply chain stability is a matter of national security, not just profit. Titans like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon saw their stocks fall by 5.1% and 4.3%, respectively, as investors calculated the massive risks to production schedules for critical weapon systems. The market is now pricing in a long-term reality where the US dollar faces pressure and the Australian dollar strengthens, driven by a 14-nation feeding frenzy to secure Australian resource contracts. The global market is signalling that Australia has just transformed into the most strategically vital resource supplier on Earth, and it has announced to everyone that the buffet is open for those willing to pay market prices. For the United States Department of Defense, this is not just a market correction, it is a full-blown national security crisis. A 2023 Department of Defense report explicitly identified 12 minerals that are absolutely essential for military systems, ranging from precision-guided missiles to advanced radar, for which the US currently has no domestic production or insufficient reserves. Australia happens to be the primary or secondary global source for 4 of the most critical items on that list: lithium, cobalt, manganese, and rare earth elements. Without guaranteed priority access to these resources, the future of the F-35 Lightning II program, Virginia-class nuclear submarines, and the Patriot missile system is placed at immediate risk. Each F-35 fighter jet alone requires over 900 pounds of rare earth materials for its targeting, navigation, and engine systems. There is no easy off-the-shelf substitute for these elements, and they are irreplaceable for maintaining modern military superiority. The reality of the situation is that the United States cannot simply pivot to domestic mining to solve this. According to defense supply chain analysts, building the necessary mining and processing infrastructure to replace Australian supply would take between 7 and 12 years and would require an investment of at least $50 billion. The Pentagon simply does not have the luxury of waiting a decade for these facilities to come online. By overplaying his hand with a predatory offer that treated a sovereign ally like a resource colony, President Trump inadvertently created a massive resource gap that his own military cannot bridge within any operationally relevant timeframe. The events of this day have proven, once and for all, that the age of assumed access is officially dead. The global scramble for resources has begun, and the United States has just discovered that the nations controlling the building blocks of modern power are no longer obligated to hand them over at a discount.